Welcome to Death Row Cases, the podcast where every week we follow the case of someone who's about to be executed, or once was, in America. This is the very first episode, so first of all, thank you so much for listening. Most death row cases are long, information-heavy cases. Because of that, there will always be at least a part 1, which goes live on Monday, and often also a part 2, which goes live on Thursday. I want to thank you again in advance for listening, and if you have any tips, I would genuinely love to hear them. I'm doing my absolute best, and I hope you can appreciate that. I'm doing this purely out of my own interest in these cases, and I wanted to share that interest with you. As I'm recording this, it's Monday, July 13th. Right now, sitting in the Florida State Prison in Stark, there's a 74-year-old man who already knows the day he's going to die. Not somewhere, not vaguely, not in the future. He has a date, a time, and he even knows which room. In this case, we're talking about Dennis Sochor, who has been on death row for almost 40 years. He was already there before I was born, and I imagine before a lot of you listening were born too. But this story doesn't begin in a prison cell. It begins on a beach at a bar in Florida on the last night of 1981 with an 18-year-old girl who just wanted to celebrate New Year's with a friend. Let's go back to that moment. Before we do, a quick word on how we research these cases. For every episode of this podcast, we use public court records, rulings from higher courts, published news coverage, and where possible, statements from advocacy organizations on both sides of the death penalty debate. We don't take a position on guilt or innocence beyond what a court has established, and we try to be as honest as possible about what is and isn't known with certainty. In a case like this one, 40 years old, with a perpetrator who confessed but whose case is still being contested decades later, that distinction between fact and assumption matters more than ever. Broward County, Florida, the late 70s and early 80s. This is a period when cities like Fort Lauderdale are turning into the destination for young people looking for sun, beaches, and nightlife. The region is already known as a magnet for spring break crowds, but even outside of that season, the beaches and bars draw a young, easygoing crowd. It's a time of optimism, of bars keeping their doors open deep into the night, and of a trust between strangers that, looking back, often turns out to have been naive. That's the atmosphere on the last night of 1981. The Banana Boat is one of those classic beach bars where everyone shows up on New Year's Eve. Tourists, locals, people who are just barely old enough to get in. It's crowded, loud, and nobody walking in that night expects it to be the last time they see someone alive. Among the people there that night, Patricia Gifford, 18 years old, with a friend. There's relatively little about Patricia herself in the public record. That's something that stands out when you research this case. Most of the sources, court documents, news reports, appellate filings focus almost entirely on the perpetrator. Who Patricia was before that night, what her dreams were, how she's remembered by friends and family. That kind of personal detail is barely there in the sources available for this episode. That probably says as much about how our justice system and our media tend to treat victims versus perpetrators as it does about this case specifically. It's a pattern you see across a lot of older cases. The perpetrator gets a name, a biography, sometimes even sympathy through mitigating circumstances. The victim often becomes little more than a name and an age in a ruling. Here's what we do know. She was 18. She was out with a friend to celebrate the new year, the way thousands of young people do every year. And she deserved to be able to do that without it becoming her last night. That night, Patricia and her friend meet two brothers, Dennis Sochor and his younger brother Gary. There's drinking, dancing. It's a night like thousands of others in beach towns like this one. Nothing about the encounter itself suggests danger. Neither woman has any reason to think these two brothers are anything other than two guys who, just like them, are simply celebrating New Year's. Later that night, Patricia's friend falls asleep in the car in the parking lot. It's a detail that stings every time you hear it. How ordinary, how innocent that decision was. Just resting in the car for a bit while your friend is still inside, or outside talking to some new people. Nobody in that moment thinks this is the last time they'll see their friend alive. Patricia decides to go with the brothers in Dennis Sochor's work van. The plan? Go get breakfast somewhere. A completely ordinary decision, the kind of decision thousands of people make every weekend without ever thinking twice about it. A ride to get breakfast after a night out. There is nothing reckless about that decision in itself. Nothing we can point to afterward and say Patricia did something wrong. That's an important thing to hold on to throughout this whole series. The victim is never the problem, no matter how ordinary, everyday the choices were that led up to it. Patricia Gifford was never seen again. According to the confessions Dennis Sochor would give years later, he stopped his van in a remote spot, not for breakfast. When Patricia refused to have sex with him, he became enraged. He strangled her. What happened to her body afterward remains, for the most part, unknown. It was never found. Not in 1982, not in the years after, and not now, more than 40 years later. That detail alone sets this case apart from a lot of the other death row cases we'll cover in this series. There's a confession, there's a conviction, but there's no body. In legal terms, there's actually a specific concept for this: corpus delicti, literally the body of the crime. Traditionally, the idea was that a murder case without a body, without physical evidence of death, was extremely difficult for a prosecutor to prove. Legal systems around the world gradually came to accept, over the course of the 20th century, that a conviction is possible even without a body, provided there's other convincing evidence. A confession, for example, or witness testimony, or forensic evidence of another kind. In the case against Dennis Sochor, that's exactly what would come into play. No body, but statements that would change everything. There's something else that makes this absence of a body especially painful. For the family of a missing or murdered victim, finding the body is often a crucial step in the grieving process, something to bury, a place to visit. For Patricia Gifford's family, that place doesn't exist. More than 40 years later, it still doesn't. We'll come back to that in part 3 of this series, because even decades later, this detail still plays a role in the legal fight surrounding this case. When Patricia didn't come home, her friend raised the alarm. Police opened an investigation into her disappearance. Keep in mind, this is 1981 to 1982. There's no Amber Alert system, no social media to reach thousands of people within minutes, no cell phones to trace someone's last location. A missing persons investigation back then relied mostly on old-fashioned legwork, tracking down witnesses, canvassing the neighborhood, and hoping someone had seen something. Local television aired a photo of Patricia from the New Year's party with an unknown man standing next to her. In an era without facial recognition software, a local news broadcast was often the most powerful investigative tool police had. And in this case, it worked. That photo turned out to be the turning point. Sochor's roommates recognized him on the news, and according to later testimony, he left shortly after. He fled the state of Florida. And right there, in what should have been an ordinary search for a missing girl, the main suspect also vanished from the radar for the next 5 years. 5 years is a long time. 5 years during which Patricia's family must have lived with uncertainty, with unanswered questions, knowing that the man who presumably knew what happened to their daughter or sister was simply living his life somewhere else. This kind of prolonged uncertainty, a case that seems stuck with no clear path forward, comes up more often in death row cases than you'd think. And it's exactly this kind of prolonged human suffering that almost always gets lost in the dry legal language of court files. It also raises a broader question we'll come back to throughout this podcast. How often does someone actually manage to evade justice for years, simply by moving to another state and building a new life? In an era without centralized digital law enforcement databases, without automatic links between police departments in different states, that was easier to pull off than you might think today. Someone attempting something similar today would run into license plate recognition, shared law enforcement databases, and digital footprints fairly quickly. In the early 80s, the odds of staying off the radar for 5 years were considerably higher. It wasn't until 1986, 5 years after Patricia Gifford's disappearance, that Dennis Sochor was caught. Not through detective work, not from a tip, but from something completely mundane. He ran a red light in DeKalb County, Georgia. Take a moment to really let that sink in. 5 years on the run, 5 years living under the radar, and finally caught over a red light. It's one of those moments in criminal history you almost couldn't make up. The sheer randomness of a simple traffic violation, catching up with a man who'd been fleeing something for 5 years. What the officers that night couldn't have known was that they'd just pulled over a man who had been wanted for 5 years for a murder in Florida. And what happened next, during questioning, would become the core of a case that to this day still hasn't been definitively closed. This kind of coincidence comes up more often in the history of solved cold cases than you'd expect, and it says something about how unpredictable catching a fugitive really is. Sometimes it's a tip from an observant neighbor. Sometimes it's, like here, a simple traffic stop. Sometimes it takes decades before DNA technology finally cracks an old case. What these cases have in common is that the eventual breakthrough is rarely the result of a dramatic chase or a brilliant deduction, and far more often the result of patience, chance, and simply keeping a file open, even when the odds of a breakthrough seem slim. For Patricia Gifford's family, those 5 years of waiting must have been unbearable. No certainty, no arrest, and a perpetrator walking free while they were left with the question of what exactly had happened to their daughter or sister. That kind of prolonged uncertainty, where a family doesn't know for years whether a case will ever be solved, might be one of the heaviest and most overlooked consequences of a crime like this. Before we go further with the story, a bit about where all of this takes place. Florida is one of the American states where the death penalty isn't just on the books, it's actually carried out, and fairly regularly. It's one of the states with the largest death row population in the country, and in recent years, the state has significantly picked up its pace of executions. That matters because the context this case unfolds in isn't neutral. Some states in America have abolished the death penalty entirely. Others still have it on the books, but haven't carried out an execution in years. And then you have states like Florida, where the system is still fully operational, including a governor who regularly signs death warrants. That difference between states is exactly why a case like this almost never exists in isolation. Where someone is convicted, in which state, under which jury system, can literally mean the difference between life in prison and death. We mentioned this briefly already. Florida allows a jury to recommend the death penalty without every juror agreeing. Only a handful of states in the U.S. have a rule like that. In most jurisdictions, including internationally, the standard is that for the harshest possible punishment, the one that can't be undone, unanimity should be the bare minimum requirement. Florida sees it differently. And as you'll hear on Thursday, that's exactly what happened in Dennis Sochor's case too. There's one more thing that makes this case unusual within the context of the death row stories we'll be covering on this podcast. Most cases that make the news are recent. A murder from a few years back, a trial that's still very much in the public eye. This one is different. The crime itself is now more than 4 decades behind us. Entire generations have grown up, technologies have come and gone, and yet this case has never really been closed. That means this series covers a story that stretches across an enormous span of time. From a beach bar in 1981 to a traffic stop in 1986, to a courtroom in the late 80s, to decades of appeals, all the way to the summer of 2026 when we're recording this episode. Before we wrap up this first part, one more thing. As you've heard, this case is unusual in more ways than one. No body, a confession that's still being contested decades later, and a timeline stretching over more than 40 years. Over the next 2 episodes, we're going to dig into exactly how that timeline unfolded, and why a case that looks simple on paper, a perpetrator who confessed, ended up dragging through the legal system for this long in practice. Thursday, the arrest, the 3 confessions Dennis Sochor gave, and the trial where his own brother became the key witness against him. A jury that voted 10-2 in favor of the death penalty, in one of only 2 states where that's legally valid without unanimity. And we'll look at how this case eventually made its way all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, before Sochor's conviction had even become final.